Well, welcome to our SOAP videos. This is week number 4 in the Gospel of Luke. And Gary, where are we?
Yeah, so last week Jesus started his ministry, and it wasn't very spectacular. He started in his hometown in Nazareth, and it ended up with him with them trying to throw him off of a cliff. So this week he fares much better than that. But for the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've been going through what everybody's going to be reading for the upcoming week. I kind of want to change that a little bit, and let's take a step back and try to see what Luke's doing from a big picture point of view.
Okay.
So we know that Jesus is really starting his ministry in Capernaum, and it's on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, and he's going to make that his headquarters. So we got that. He's kind of going to be establishing his base here this week, which is kind of a cool point.
Which is interesting because the synoptic writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, synoptic means to see together, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke typically see the same things, sort of telling the same story. John goes in a completely different direction sometimes. But John is the only one who tells about the first several months of Jesus' ministry down in the Jerusalem, Judea area before he comes back north.
Okay.
So
he was in the Jerusalem area, and yet now he's back up north.
Right. So he's baptized by John. He's tempted by the devil in the wilderness, and then he comes back into that area. And John says he does some ministry there. He talks to Nicodemus, some of those things. He's back and forth between Galilee and the Jerusalem area. Matthew, Mark, Luke don't really tell us much about that, and so we have to fast forward a little bit in the timeline to get to where Luke is, and so he's going to skip a few things.
Okay.
But
so is it fair to say that he is starting with the Jews, though, and his standard operating procedure would be when he goes into a place, he's starting in a synagogue?
Well, yeah, in most places he'd go into the synagogue. Of course, he's in Israel, so he's going to be working with. He's offering the kingdom to the Jews. So he's definitely going to be working with Jews first, primarily.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I see 3 things happening in Luke, or Luke focusing on 3 distinct areas. The first would be people, right? He's gathering people. Jesus is gathering his people more and more, and that's one of the first things that I see primarily happens that Luke definitely is focusing on.
Yeah, and there are big crowds, like probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. And so we actually see sort of categories, right? So there's the crowds or the multitudes, depending on your translation. Then you have the disciples. Okay, these are the people who are actually following him because they think he could be Messiah. They're trying to learn something. They've sort of bought in, and at least at this point they're buying in. Many of them will leave later. The crowds don't necessarily have not necessarily bought in yet.
Right, so they're kind of there for the show.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Well, the healings and
there's some cool stuff going on, and there's a bunch of people there. Let's go to the county fair and see what's going on.
Well, and they're also Gentiles. A lot of Gentiles. Matthew tells us that they came in from even outside of Israel because they heard of this miracle guy. Right. And they're bringing their sick people and everything. So you got the crowds they don't even have to know who he is. They're just, in fact, sometimes you see that. Who is this guy? Oh, it doesn't matter. He healed my, XYZ.
Yeah.
Then you have your disciples who are actually following him. Could this be the Messiah? And then we'll find that he's going to call the apostles, and the apostles are those whom he commissions with ministry. So there's a difference. We usually call them the 12 disciples.
Right.
There's a point coming up here where it's not just 12 disciples anymore. There's still hundreds or thousands of disciples, but it's 12 apostles because they're actually joining him in ministry. So
joining him, and then they taking it forward.
Well, in the Acts, and after the crucifixion.
Right.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
So we have to. We want to make sure that we see when it just says, "Oh, there's disciples." Well, there's. There's also crowds, and there's lots of stuff going on there.
So we've said Luke is certainly looking at the humanity of Jesus and people, and the way he's treating people is certainly a big part of it.
Yeah.
Second big part I see is Jesus' message and healings.
Yeah.
What is he teaching, and who is he healing?
Yeah.
And so we'll see more of that in the up and coming weeks.
Well, and in this week especially, you'll notice that I think that nearly every miracle, if not every miracle, is a healing type miracle. which I mean, he did a lot of, but from Luke's standpoint, as the doctor, I mean,
that's the ones he's going to focus on.
Right. Yeah. It's in Luke that he's going to, the great physician.
Right.
We see the great physician at work, written down by the human physician.
Right, and the miracles are also Jesus' proof of who he says he is, right, or where he came from.
That he's Messiah. He was doing these things. You'll notice that if you look back in the Old Testament, there are certain things that the prophets said will not exist in the kingdom. There won't be demons in the kingdom. There won't be lame people in the kingdom. There won't be blind people in the kingdom. So what does Jesus do? He casts out demons. He heals lame people. He heals blind people.
Nice.
And so he's giving them a little taste of the kingdom. If you would actually follow me, I'm proving to you, not that I'm God, but I'm proving to you that I'm sent by God. That I am the Messiah you're looking for.
Right. And then the last piece that we're going to continue to follow around is the religious group. Right, that there's pushback by the Jewish religious group almost from the very start. Now it starts out very nice; they ask questions, but it doesn't end up that way.
Nicodemus is a great example of that in John 3. He's a Pharisee; he's one of the leading Pharisees, the teacher of Israel, and he comes to have a conversation with Jesus. He's not bad mouthing him; he's not doing any of that.
Right.
So we see Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes, or experts in the law. All three of these groups started after the exile in the Old Testament. That's when synagogues started. They're like, okay, we don't have a temple now. What are we going to do to be able to remember the law? Pharisees became the sort of your conservative wing, holders onto the law as the Constitution. We've got to interpret it literally and build actually laws around it so that we don't break it. Sadducees were more of your liberal wing. They were more political. We're told that they did not believe in supernatural things at all, not miracles, or not resurrection, not angels. They didn't really care about that. Much more involved in politics than they were religion. They only believed in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy as inspired by God. And so it's funny, every time Jesus interacts with them, he quotes from the Pentateuch. Because if he quoted from anywhere else,
they wouldn't buy it.
Right.
They wouldn't.
Right.
Wasn't in their
So they would accept other parts of the Old Testament only so far as Moses wrote on the same topic, if it extended the Pentateuch. Right. It's really interesting. The scribes, or the experts in the law, surprisingly, were not experts in the law itself. They were experts in all of the other rabbinic tradition and everything. To the point that sometimes they didn't even know what the law said. They knew what everybody else, all the commentaries said about it. So you see these three, you're talking the religious groups, you see these groups and how they interact with Jesus, and the questions that they ask are where they're coming from, is where their mindset is. Right. And that's very interesting and he knows how to navigate. All three of them, he knows where they're coming from, and he navigates them very well. Right.
So, as you read this week, make sure to take a look at the people, Jesus' teachings and the miracles, and then also the religious leaders on what they're doing. Yeah. So what do you think are some things that we need to look out for this week's readings?
One of them is just really short, but we get a list of the apostles in here, and Luke mentions one name, and I've got it written down here. Luke's list of his apostles is a little bit different. In Luke, in Matthew and Mark, the guy's name is Thaddeus. In Luke, he's called Judas, the son of James, as opposed to Judas Iscariot. So it could be a Greek versus a Hebrew name. It could be whatever. But if somebody's like, where'd Thaddeus go? He's in there. He's just called by a different name. That was just more of a fun fact. Here's here's the important one. Jesus calls himself Lord of the Sabbath. Right. And he's going to, you'll read it, they're walking through the grain field, and the apostles, the disciples, are picking heads of grain on the Sabbath. And, rubbing it together and to try to get out the seed, or, whatever, the grains. And the Pharisees, sticklers of the law, right, are like, you can't do that on the Sabbath. And Jesus points back to David, and then he says, listen, the Sabbath was given as a gift to you. The Sabbath is supposed to serve you, not you serve the Sabbath, basically, right? It's a gift. But I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the one who gave it to you to begin with. I can do anything I want, which is interesting because as you and I talked about it, could Jesus make up his own rules for the Sabbath?
Yeah.
Of course he could.
Right.
But did he? He didn't. Jesus followed the law. He didn't follow tradition. He loved breaking tradition, but he always followed the law. He never broke any of the law. And so he was able to tap into what was the spirit of the law, what was the letter of the law. And he never broke that, never violated that. But he was able to use it to show, I'm Lord. I am the one who designed this. I know better than you do.
Right. Here's what I meant by it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it's not hurting anything for these guys to have lunch on the Sabbath as we're walking through the field.
Right. In fact, it was not a requirement, but they had an obligation, right? People that owned the field, if somebody was walking through it, it was their right to actually do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. God specifically said, don't pick every ear of corn.
Yeah.
Don't, get every grain. Don't leave it for people.
Yeah.
Your fellow, so.
Right. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's one that I see in here where Jesus, Luke is mostly about his humanity, but Jesus is asserting some deity even through here. I know what I'm doing. I'm still Lord here.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, mine is the superiority of the new, and I think it ties in exactly with what we're talking about here. Mine's at the end of chapter 5. There's a lot in there, but I want to pick out two points. The first point is really, notice that John's disciples and the Pharisees almost seem to be in a goal of who can fast the most, right? And the whole idea was God's put down a law, and the people were exploiting it to their benefit. So instead of taking maybe a day and fasting, and instead of preparing the food, spending the money, use the time to study God more and learn a little bit more about them, they were fasting as much as they could and saying, I'm more religious than you because I fast more than you do, so I'm better than that. And, we can obviously laugh at them, but I think we need to also think about what we're doing today if we just go to social media. I mean, there are so many posts on there where there are religious posts coming that say, you have to like this post, and I usually don't get to the or, right? But it's like, come on, really? If I don't, I'm not a Christian?
Right.
Am I considered a Christian? Somebody's not going to get money because I don't forward this on. So the same thing is easily happening today in the world.
Good point.
Then the second thing I have is still under the same category, the superiority of the new. We're talking about new wineskins and old wineskins and new wine and old wine and the intermixing of the two. And, he's not really talking about wine. But what Jesus is not saying is, I came to throw the Old Testament law away.
Right.
Which is kind of an easy thing to think about saying because he could say that if he wanted to.
And we're not under it, and so people think that he just did away with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's really clear in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. It says, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. So he is saying, look, I am fulfilling the old, not me, Jesus. Jesus is fulfilling the old, and since it's fulfilled, we need something new. And then he's bringing in the new.
Yeah. And because he's the one who fulfilled it, he's the one who gets to bring in the new, right?
He gets to bring in the new,
yeah. It's like winner takes all.
Yeah. Yeah, so kind of a cool little thing there.
Good. Well, I think we're, a couple of chapters in this one, so I think that's a pretty good... That's a lot of stuff to look out for. So what else do you see in there? Make sure that you put it in the comments, whether on Facebook or on YouTube. Share with us what you've learned. And make sure you subscribe on Facebook. Like our page on Facebook. Subscribe on YouTube. make sure that you download the app, all of the different things, so that when we come back next week, you can keep on reading. If you need a SOAP card, you can go to oaktreechurch.com/SOAP and find one there in PDF format. And then we'll see you next week.
See everyone next week.